events that I'm about to describe to you are indeed all true. I've had some very curious things that have happened throughout my lifetime, and I want to share this one with you, or this particular series of events. In writing this and then reading it over, I noticed that there's considerable amount of bitterness towards my ex-wife, and I apologize for that. Right off the bat, I'm going to try to edit it out as I tell the story to you. So, but I apologize for it. There's still a lot of bitterness over the hell that I was put through, but that has nothing to do with the story. So anyways, for the sake of the people currently living in the house in question, I cannot release the address, or I will not. I must suffice it to say that it is in Oscoda, Michigan, somewhere on Cedar Lake Road. Now, my dad and mom, Frank and Lorraine Morrison, moved to the house in 1971 when my dad retired from General Motors due to health issues, and I was still in school, and I moved with them. The house is a small house, and I suspect it was originally someone's vacation cottage. A spare bedroom had been added to the rear of the house, jutting into the backyard. It had a small porch off from that room. My bedroom was upstairs and ran the full length of the house. In the wintertime, that room could get very cold, as it caught the wind sweeping across from frozen Benetton Lake. And in the summer, it was often stiflingly hot. Frequently in the summer, I would sleep in the spare room downstairs, as it had two large windows, and they opened up inward and looked out on the backyard. And a small shed that my dad had set up out there with his tools. And there was also a cover for a well house out there. There was really no place isolated in this house due to its size. However, when I slept in that back bedroom, I always felt isolated, somewhat distant from the rest of the house. And it always seemed to me that I was really not alone in that room. It didn't frighten me, but it just felt odd. But I really enjoyed the room in the summertime. If there was to be an extended spell of heat, I would move my prized possession, a really cool component stereo system that I worked really hard to get, and I'd move it into that room because I used the stereo constantly. It was a cool Nico amplifier, and it gave off this really almost eerie ring glow that the sound was top notch. It really has nothing to do with anything, just a memory there. But let's move on though. I just needed to set the stage. At that point in time, I had no idea what lay hidden in the backyard just outside those double windows, and quite likely also beneath the room itself. Now, I mentioned the porch on that spare bedroom. There were smaller double windows opening in from the porch side wall, and a door was on that wall also that was always kept locked, but you could open to walk out onto the porch. There were literally multitudes of times I would be in the room and would see a shadow figure pass by outside these two smaller windows, but there was never anyone there. And it was never more than a momentarily unsettling, a fleeting glimpse. And had I known about the phenomenon known as shadow people, frequently reported on the internet, I might have been perhaps a little more concerned. But those were the blissful days before the internet and such things were not common knowledge. Now, seeing the shadow figures was a most common phenomenon in there, so let me take just a moment to share with you what the current concept of what are called shadow people is. The following is from Wikipedia, and I quote, "A shadow person, also known as a shadow figure, shadow being, or black mass, is the perception of a patch of shadow as a living humanoid figure, particularly as interpreted by believers in the paranormal or supernatural as the presence of a spirit or other entity," end quote. Now, before we move on, Heidi Hollis, who has published several books on the topic of shadow people, very much described what I saw. She described them as dark silhouettes with shapes and profiles that flicker in and out of your peripheral vision, which is how I viewed them. Now, while at the time I wondered about what I was seeing, I never perceived them as menacing, and just a little unconcerting and perplexing. I have always been a writer, at heart. And when I say always, from my youngest childhood memories when I could pick up a pencil or sit at a typewriter, I loved to write. I wrote historical nonfiction as well as short stories, which generally had a supernatural theme, the short stories, that is. And at one point, I had a desk sitting in front of the big double windows and often sat there to write. One evening, lightning flashing off in the distance, past Benetton Lake, I sat there very tired and trying to come up with a story idea, and I fell asleep there at the typewriter. Now, I'll tie this all together in a bit, but please bear with me. I fell asleep at the desk as the wind was picking up and the rain was beginning to fall, and I had a dream that I later wrote into a story. And in the dream, I could not make out a location, but I was sitting on a mound of dirt, grass covered. And I somehow recognized it as an Indian burial mound in the dream. And in the dream, a spirit came to me as I was sitting on the mound. I believe the spirit was female, though in the dream the image was quite foggy. And she, if that's the case, was trying to tell me something, get a message to me, but I couldn't understand what it was. Now, a few years later, there would be another mysterious message being given to me in connection with that backyard, but I was awake then. But it does tie into the overall picture and the part the room seemed to play in it. Anyways, when I awoke, I dashed off a story based on the dream, which I simply titled Indian Spirit. It was never published, as I filed it away and never submitted it to a publisher. Perhaps sometime I will share it with you. The following spring, I made an interesting discovery in the backyard, less than a stone's throw from the back bedroom, but I was still oblivious as to what really was going on at one time in that backyard. My dad had a bad hip, and he had a hip replacement, and asked if I would help put in a small garden in the backyard. He had always loved gardening, but he could not get down on his knees to do planting. So we tilled up a small patch, and I got down and began making furrows with the side of my hand, and I cut it on something very sharp. I moved away the bloodied dirt, and there was the most beautiful crafted arrowhead that I would ever see. It was about 2 inches long and deeply notched on the base. It captured my imagination as few things ever have. I'd always had a love of Native American culture, and to find this only feet from my bedroom. I remember holding that point for hours and thinking about the Indian man so long ago that made it, what he must have been like. What was his family like? What were his interests? It was not till years later, thanks to my very good friend Jerry Wagner, that I learned it was a spear point, a late woodland, making it 1,400 to 500 years old. Now, as I continued planting the garden, I kept my eyes wide open for other arrowheads, but nothing turned up. There were other paranormal experiences that occurred in our yard and the neighborhood, but I did not at the time connect them to particularly my parents' yard, nor that house, our bedroom. Now, on occasion, my sister and her family from Saginaw would come up for a visit, or my brother's family from Bridgeport, and always they occupied that room when they were visiting. And my family, being as tight-assed as they are, would never admit publicly to experiencing anything odd. However, their one little boy, my nephew Ray, who I loved with all my heart, was always terrified to sleep alone in that room. He would literally scream in fear and come running out. It was not just a case of a little boy being alone. He was genuinely terrified, but I never found out why. He never spoke about it. Well, of course, time marches on, and with it, many changes. I got married, and I became deeply involved in Native American history of the area under the tutelage of local expert Jerry Wagner, who again was one of the best friends I have ever had, and I miss him on a daily basis. Well, anyways, and I became an expectant father of a child I'm sure was actually fathered by one of my brothers, and not my oldest brother. But anyways, to make it easier on my wife, so she would not have to climb the stairs up to the bedroom, we took up residence in that back bedroom, and again, shadowy figures often passed the window. But let me back up to the previous summer, as these events of moving into that bedroom happened in November of that particular year. I had assembled a very large collection of area artifacts, mostly from two sites, the Goodwin Gresham site. So many artifacts, in fact, that I put up a building in the backyard to house them all, a sort of private museum, again inspired by my mentor Jerry Wagner. I also had a business restoring furniture at the time, and I needed a place to work on that, so I put up a larger barn-shaped building only a few feet from the museum. And again, please bear with me, as I promise I'll tie all of this together shortly. We had a dog named Samson, whose house was in between the two buildings so as to alert us if anyone was messing around at night, who should not be, as there's quite a market for Indian artifacts, and at that time our neighbors were, they were quite cagey, if you will. I was working on furniture one hot day when the woman I married was taking a pan of water to Samson, who had been feverishly digging to make a cool spot for himself to lay in. I went over to see how he was doing and looked down at Samson in the hole. And laying there in the dirt were several large Indian pottery shards that he had dug up right next to the museum building. What are the chances of that happening? So I set to work excavating the surrounding area, which, by the way, ended up covering only about a 6 foot, or coming to about within 6 feet from my bedroom, or the back bedroom, I should say. And over the following weeks, I recovered over 1,000 pottery shards, as well as an array of stone tools. And I also found a unique-looking stone resembling a face and profile, and I actually set that aside, and I forgot about it. Now remember the mound in my dream. Well, I also found a mound, much smaller than in my dream, and it was made of flakes of chert, mounded up with a concave, shallow, cup-like stone on the top. And it was very odd. And the two things that jumped into my mind first, the dream and the distinct impression that the mound was some sort of an altar. Later in my investigations of the artifacts, I found I communicated with the early Sites Research Society, in particular James Whittle, who headed that organization at the time. It was his impression that the little mound was indeed an altar possibly used by a tribal shaman. So much was going on at that time. We were getting ready to move to a larger house up in Greenbush, Michigan, and I planned on doing more work in the yard, but the property sold much too quickly than expected, and with winter coming on, I didn't get back to doing any further excavating. There was, however, much more to happen before we made the move. Oh yeah, and I nearly forgot this tidbit that is perhaps quite important. I found a few bone fragments, presumably the remains of some ancient meal, but there was one bone, maybe 10 to 12 inches long, in close proximity to the mound of chert flakes, and that bone was different. And Jerry Wagner examined the bone as well as others, and the consensus was that it was a human arm bone. Now, everything to that point made me wonder what in prehistoric times happened on this property that was at that point ours. And it was not just the backyard. I had also found some artifacts under the house and in the front yard. And I began to wonder more about what these shadowy figures actually were. Things were about to get stranger, much, much stranger. One afternoon, I decided to take the pottery that I had assembled along with a few other artifacts out to Jerry's house for him to check them out. I was in the car when, as an afterthought, I remembered that face-shaped stone that I mentioned earlier that I had set out and forgotten. And it was still out by the shed where I had left it months before. Now I went and grabbed it, put it in the box or bag with the other pieces, and headed out to Jerry's house, where I met with him and his wife, Marilyn. And once out there, we went into the living room, and I laid out the artifacts on the floor. And Jerry took the face-like stone and propped up the pottery reconstruction with it. We three talked for hours about the pottery and the site in general. It was an intensive conversation, and I recall that it seemed that we were almost back almost back there with those ancient Native Americans. And when we were done, Jerry helped me put the items back in the box, but when he picked up that face-like stone, um, he had a strange look on his face. And he asked me, what are the symbols on this stone? And there, there was a string of letter-like symbols, and all three of us knew they had not been there before when our conversation began, and curiously, some of them were actually raised from the surface of the stone. Well, I got a chill, and felt more and more that all the strangeness in that room was connected with the property's ancient history. That night on my way home, alone in the dark car, is the only time I felt any fear connected with any of the situations that I've so far described. I had the overwhelming desire to stop the car and toss that stone into Van Letten Lake as far as I could. But I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't, because there was much more to come. When I returned home, my dad and mom and the woman to whom I was married also saw the figures on the stone, which soon began to fade away. And I believe it was that night that I had the first in a series of dreams very similar, and that I still occasionally have. There is a large oak tree in that backyard. And in the dream, I'm always digging beneath it. I'm always at the point of making a find, but always waking up, just as I do. And I regret never getting to dig there, as I believe a solution to a growing mystery might just lie there. At Thanksgiving that year, Jerry and I were invited to the home of a friend and publisher of Jerry's that lived over in Cummins, Michigan for dinner, Nelson Yoder. It was a bit of a drive, so I took the stone with us so Jerry and I could further speculate upon it. And at the dinner, there were about 12 or 13 people gathered, and somehow Jerry and I stirred the conversation to the stone. These were all very history-minded people, and they were all rather engrossed by what we were telling them, and thrilled to hear that I had the stone out in my truck. All wanted to see it, so I dashed out into the cold, grabbed it, and brought it into the house. The stone began making its way around the table, and something, well, bizarre began to happen. Witnessed by all these people, symbols appeared on the stone, and they were changing very quick, much in the manner as numbers on an old-school digital watch would change. They weren't old school at the time, though. My times change. Anyways, I began trying to mark them down on paper, but they changed so fast that I couldn't catch them all. A man named Mike, whose last name evades me, was so upset by the spectacle that he got up from the table without a word, and he left. After that evening, it just stopped. Very few figures appeared after that on the stone, but a lot of people witnessed it in a period of 3 to 4 weeks that it was active. So let's move on. We moved to our new home in Greenbush, and I never got to do more work at the site in my folks' backyard, and that is a major regret. There are so many little details that I've skimmed over for the sake of brevity, like, for example, the conclusions that James Whittle from Early Sites Research Society came to about the overall site. He felt it had some very spiritual significant connections, and that the stone with the images was part of a shaman's medicine kit. But what do I think? Well, that room was one of several catalysts to me. I believe there was a message somehow on that stone that was being conveyed, but I had no idea what it was because the picture is incomplete. And those pieces to this puzzle still lie in 3 areas of that yard that I did not get to excavate or work on. You know, every room seems to have a personality, all of its own, and that downstairs bedroom did have a personality, slightly influenced by the life energies, perhaps, of people who had lived on that very spot as many as 1,400 years before, during the late woodland period. How interesting that despite the long, long trail of years, my path, for a short time, deliciously crossed with theirs. Thank you for taking time to stop and listen. I'm going to put some videos in the comment section that go into more detail on different things that happened there. at the house and with that particular stone. If you have comments, suggestions, remarks, whatever, please leave them in the comment section. I always love to hear from you, from my viewers. And that's about it. God bless y'all, and have a good night.